of all, let me explain why I became interested in the afterlife. Of course, since I edit Tokana, I really am interested in things like the afterlife. But I started to feel that I truly wanted to study it seriously. I think the reason is probably because I had a near-death experience myself. This happened about 5 years and a month ago. On a particularly cold and freezing day, I accidentally fell fast asleep while still wearing my thick scarf. When I finally came to and regained my senses, I realized that I had somehow pulled the scarf tight with my shoulders and it was completely and utterly strangling my neck. So I thought to myself, wow. And at that very exact moment, I had suddenly and unexpectedly come right out of my physical body and was looking down at my own self from high above. But the actual state of my body at that specific moment was really quite bad. I was visibly convulsing and foaming at the mouth. I was thinking, wow, I am truly on the very verge of death. As I looked down at it from the ceiling, and I thought, no, I really should go back right now. But I was just being pulled further up. I kept going higher and higher into the air, and just as I thought, no, it was like I suddenly appeared in a vast and pitch-black space. I thought to myself, this is the extraordinary and supernatural experience I have heard so much about. But as I was doing that, I could even see what you might call a long tunnel. I was like, wow, I have finally arrived at the end, and my heart was beating incredibly fast, so I knew I had to get back to my life. I desperately tried paddling vertically in a frantic crawl-style motion. I was thrashing about wildly, thinking about what I was doing, when suddenly I found myself back inside my own physical body. I moved my body just a little bit, which I think was because the oxygen was finally circulating again and I regained my consciousness. I have actually done out-of-body experiences quite often in the past, which is like leaving your physical body behind. When you initiate an out-of-body experience, it is like a really thick and sturdy string sticking out from your back, and the physical body and astral body are connected by this very elastic string. So no matter how far your astral body gets away from your physical body, for example, by taking a long walk, the string has the power to pull you back together, so you can just float back up easily. But during my terrifying near-death experience, there was no string at all, and it was like I was floating up like an octopus with its string cut. So I think that simple euphoria and near-death experiences are clearly and distinctly different, and this profound experience made me want to properly study the concept of the afterlife. In America, there was a movement to seriously study near-death experiences starting in the 1970s. Today, scholars from a wide range of fields, psychologists, psychiatrists, neurologists, neurophysiologists, religious scholars, philosophers, and more, are interested in this topic. In 1990, an international conference on near-death experience research was held at Georgetown University in Washington, gathering 300 researchers from around the world. There are truly fascinating papers on this subject worldwide, and the one I found most interesting so far is the theory proposed by George Hameroff, an emeritus professor at the University of Arizona, and Roger Penrose, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2020. They claim that there are microtubules, tiny tubes inside brain neurons, which contain quantum information, and that consciousness itself is a quantum phenomenon. According to their theory, when a person dies, the quantum information is released from the brain and spreads out into the universe. Since quantum phenomena transcend gravity and space-time, if consciousness is indeed such a phenomenon, then even if the physical body dies, consciousness itself should not die. We still don't know exactly what happens to the vast amount of information that is released into the universe, but some renowned scholars propose that perhaps at the very moment a patient who has had a near-death experience wakes up, that released quantum information swiftly returns to them. I find this theory in its own right to be extremely fascinating. In any case, I think it's a truly enjoyable endeavor to contemplate through research into the afterlife whether physical death really means the death of our soul or consciousness, or what death actually is. And this year, 2021, there was a piece of news that might mark a major turning point in the history of afterlife research. Robert Bigelow, known as a wealthy American tycoon, announced that he would offer a prize of over 100 million yen to anyone who could provide proof of the afterlife. Robert Bigelow is an American businessman and owner of a hotel chain. He is also known for running the space venture Bigelow Aerospace. However, he is also attracting a lot of attention in the occult world and is known for his strong interest in paranormal phenomena. When asked how rich Bigelow is, the answer is usually Donald Trump or Bigelow. He is a real estate mogul who is known to everyone in America. Bigelow has teamed up with NASA and the currently popular Elon Musk to build residential areas for astronauts and has done many such big jobs, which has attracted a lot of attention, but he is really just an ordinary billionaire. However, he is also passionate about occult research, and recently he was involved in the popular program that ran from 2007 to 2012. Much of the funding for Nantagon's UFO research went to Big Wallow's research lab, and it has been revealed that he has been researching all kinds of UFO cases. He also has a sort of UFO research facility where it is said that there are many pieces of metal and UFO debris that are not found on Earth. One place that is particularly noteworthy in his occult research is Skinwalker Ranch. He once purchased Skinwalker Ranch, and what happens on this ranch is that wolves that have been shot are actually unharmed and still moving. And there are also cattle mutilations where the blood of cows is drained and they are left with only their bones. It is a place where many such phenomena occur. Of course, UFOs are also cited, as are mysterious lights, luminous objects, and electronic devices. It's a place where all sorts of things like illnesses, so-called occult phenomena, and Portugal all occur, and after researching it, we've come to the conclusion that there may be some kind of place near Skinwalker Ranch that's connected to another dimension, although we're not sure if it's space, the sky, or somewhere else. But beyond that, the mystery is still a mystery, so someone else has now purchased Skinwalker Ranch and is taking over Mr. Bigelow's research. But Mr. Bigelow's son committed suicide at a very young age, and his son already has a son who is Mr. Bigelow's grandson, but he also died young from drug overdose. His wife, with whom he was with for 55 years, also passed away in recent years, and now Mr. Bigelow is Mr. Law, has a lot of money, but I think he must be feeling very lonely in his heart. So he wonders what the afterlife is like, what kind of place are the people he loves going to be, and so he has announced that he is putting a lot of effort into researching the afterlife, offering a prize and holding an essay contest. Actually, Tomoko Sumitomo, and a certain other person wrote an essay and submitted it to the contest. That person, Suzuki Takahiro, is an expert on physics and the occult, and his day job is as a management consultant. He's also written an article for Tokana, and when I told him about a time when I had a supernatural experience, he told me that he actually has memories of his past life. So, what do you mean? We realized we had something in common, and recently, speaking of which, Bigelow is holding an afterlife contest. It all started from a conversation like, he's doing something like that, isn't he? So we decided to share our respective knowledge. Like in my case, all the things I've covered for Tokana. I've been collecting research and cases about the afterlife, so I provided that information to Mr. Suzuki. And Mr. Suzuki, using his knowledge of physics up to now, then what if we try this approach? I asked him to think about how we could scientifically explain those cases, and by combining our perspectives, we thought that maybe we could construct a new, unprecedented scientific view of the afterlife. That's how we decided that the two of us would apply together. As a result, unfortunately, we didn't make it through the selection, but personally, I think maybe our idea was just a bit too new. It would have pretty much overturned the assumptions of all previous research on the afterlife. That's also part of it, you know. However, what's interesting about this paper is that it treats the afterlife as the afterlife and the other world as the other world, so to speak. In a way, it can be applied to all sorts of occult cases, or rather, it encourages us to think about them in that way. That's what I believe about this paper. I really hope everyone will listen to it. I'd like to present that in the next session. So I'd like to ask a bit about the content of that paper. First, could you explain what exactly a soul is?
Let's start from there. As you mentioned last time during your near-death experience, the soul generally takes on this kind of form, right? In other words, there's a physical body, and from around the navel, some kind of cord is attached.
Sometimes it's the navel, sometimes it's the back.
That's the kind of story it becomes. Sumi-san, you know the weight of the soul, right?
Yes, it is exactly 21 grams.
Right, 21 grams is about this much in weight. If you compare it to a marble, it is about this size. Something about this size is attached somewhere on your body, right? In other words, it might be here in this form. In Sumi-san's case, this thing leaves the body like this, goes out somewhere, and then comes back like this.
This famous concept of 21 grams is widely said to originate from early scientific reports suggesting that at the very precise moment of death, a person's total body weight suddenly decreases by approximately 21 grams in total.
Right, so the first question is, what exactly is this? In other words, something like this exists somewhere, but no one has discovered it. If you call it a soul, then supposedly they're everywhere, right? The fact that this hasn't been explained is the first mystery. That's where we started, by thinking together about its characteristics.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, everyone supposedly has a soul, and there are people whose souls have left or come out, and there are people who have died. So if there really are that many, then scientifically there should be much more evidence for them. That's where we started from.
So the two of us lined up and considered the characteristics of souls. When you list out the features, the first is that they're supposed to be everywhere. If you think about it, each person has a soul. And then, if you go to a hospital, people die regularly, so there should be lots of souls drifting around there. So even though there are supposedly so many, for some reason we can't see them. That's the first characteristic. The second is that there have been quite a lot of scientific investigations into this, right? Even though they've done all sorts of experiments like the one at Markham Castle in England, those things don't react to physical sensors.
Basically, that's right.
And then the third point. This might sound strange, but there are ghosts in places where hauntings rarely ever happen. If that's the case, you'd think there would be a lot of mischievous or malevolent ghosts around, right?
The crime rate would be higher.
Or at least it should be. If that were the case, you'd expect more people to be cursed to death by delinquents or something, but basically, except for really rare haunted spots or places called spirit world portals, ghosts just don't appear, right?
Isn't that so?
That's why it hardly ever happens. And then fourth, there are people who can see them. There really are ghosts. When you talk to various people, sometimes someone will say, actually, I can see them, and for that person, there really is a ghost right there. They can see things like, there's a ghost over there, but ordinary people can't see them. If such things really exist, what does that mean? That's the first question, isn't it?
That's what I'm most curious about.
If we take a moment to consider the answer to that question, in a way that is as straightforward and simple as possible, what would it be? Basically, spirits are physical substances that exist in the material world. Let's start by thinking that way. But if we can't see it and it doesn't react to sensors, what does that mean? It means it doesn't interact with electromagnetic forces. So it's still a substance, whether we can see it or not. Light is also an electromagnetic wave, and using radio waves for various sensors also relies on electromagnetic force. Basically, all physical measuring instruments are based on electromagnetic force. That's what they fundamentally use.
That's right, even humans perceive things that way. We recognize things through electrical signals in the brain.
And that's how it works. Brain waves are also electrical, so that's another example of electromagnetic force. So, substances that don't react with it. If we assume that's the case, it makes sense why we can't see the soul.
It doesn't react, but it still weighs 21 grams. Is that what you mean?
Yes, there are substances like that.
Things that don't react, but still exist.
What is that? Dark matter.
What exactly is this mysterious substance known as dark matter?
Even the people at Occult Entertainment University talk about dark matter. You may have heard of it, but in fact, the existence of such a thing is actually recognized in the field of physics. It's a substance that is recognized as existing. Let me briefly explain its characteristics. Dark matter definitely exists in this universe. If this didn't exist, first of all, it's understood that galaxies could not maintain their current shape and structure without it, so nearly all physicists and almost all astronomers, scientists take it as common knowledge that dark matter exists, and they even know how much of it there is. The entire Milky Way galaxy is structured and maintained by this, forming its luminous system. Our atoms, like hydrogen, helium, and so on, dark matter exists in an amount 5 times greater than the total mass of all of those combined. This is something we know. The characteristics of this dark matter. It is a substance that interacts with gravity. It responds to gravity. However, it doesn't interact with electromagnetic forces at all. So even though it exists, we can't see it. That's why, if we figure out what this actually is, it would be worthy of a Nobel Prize. That's how hot a topic this substance is right now. The properties of this thing called dark matter and the properties of souls. When you line them up and compare, they're actually very similar. That's the key point here. By the way, if there's supposed to be 5 times as much of it, you'd think there would be a ton of it around here, right? But that's actually not the case.
It's not.
You know how the Milky Way is shaped like a disk, right? The distribution of dark matter isn't in this disk, but rather it surrounds the galaxy. It actually exists as a kind of sphere. So if you look at this thin disk of the Milky Way, it's not that there's 5 times as much there. In fact, there's only about 8%.
The density?
Gravity is low. So where is the dark matter near Earth? Actually, it's probably beneath our feet, underground. In other words, since it interacts with gravity, it's drawn toward Earth, right? But since it doesn't have electromagnetic force, it just passes right through. So most of the dark matter is actually inside the Earth.
Do you mean like in the mantle?
There's a lot of it below the mantle. That's why around here it's so sparse that we don't notice it. But maybe about 21 grams of it remains here or something like that. That's the kind of story it is. Yeah.
So hypothetically speaking, if souls were actually made of dark matter, how exactly would we go about explaining that?
I'd like to think about this together, bit by bit. As I mentioned earlier, there's this thing called the soul, and it seems to be the basis of our consciousness. In neuroscience, it's believed that consciousness exists in the brain, and that the brain governs both consciousness and thought. But if we consider the phenomenon of out-of-body experiences, maybe consciousness actually resides in the soul, with the soul governing consciousness and the brain governing thought. Perhaps there's a division of roles like that. This is the premise we're starting from.
This can also explain Eben Alexander's experience.
Right? It can explain it, can it? So even though his brain had stopped functioning, he still had consciousness. And that consciousness traveled to another world. That's his story. And if we think of the soul as being made of dark matter, and that in some way it's attached to the body, then since the soul is made of dark matter, it's invisible to the eye. If you basically think about it this way, it all starts to make sense. In the medical field, people work hard to explain near-death experiences as phenomena caused by the brain, right? This is something that was often said on Takashi Tachibana's programs, for example. The idea is that humans feel fear when they die. So the brain is programmed to prevent that fear, allowing people to die happily by experiencing beautiful near-death visions. That's the mainstream view in neuroscience. However, if you think about it that way, it can't explain things like seeing your family praying from above, things that shouldn't be possible to witness.
That's true, isn't it?
So, by considering that the soul exists separately from the body, we can finally explain those kinds of things. That's why, if we start from the premise that the soul is made of a different substance, it becomes easier to understand.
Paranormal phenomena themselves do actually occur, don't they?
That's right. It's about how we interpret this, but if we think of the soul as being made of dark matter, then that's why we can't see it, and it's a form of consciousness different from the brain. But the thing is, I have one, Sumi-san has one, and everyone else has one too. That means these souls should actually be able to communicate with each other. In other words, dark matter is a substance that can't communicate with electromagnetic forces. It's a different kind of matter, but we still don't really know what kind of substance it is.
Of course, that's true.
But if they're made of the same substance, then they should be able to interact with each other. So I think that spiritual phenomena are basically events where souls communicate with each other.
You mean the spiritual phenomena themselves?
If we set that as a premise, there are various things we can interpret. For example, in the afterlife, during a near-death experience, it's said that you can talk with the spirits of your ancestors when you go to the other side, right? It's not strange to say that the souls of your ancestors are there, and because both sides are in a spiritual state, they're able to communicate with each other, is it?
Sharing the same substance lets them communicate?
That's what it means. And then, when it comes to people who can see spirits, the truth is that, through some kind of mechanism, their own spirit is able to perceive things not through the 5 senses, but as a so-called 6th sense, a 4th sense beyond the usual ones. Let's say there are people who have developed this ability. For those people, spirits are visible. For people whose spiritual sense has become a sensory organ, that's why a small number of people can tell where spirits are or what they're saying. Theoretically, there's nothing strange about that.
Right now I'm pointing to this area, but in the occult or spiritual circles, people often say that there might be some kind of substance around the pineal gland here, but maybe, just maybe, what's actually in there is dark matter.
So, if we operate under the assumption that souls are actually composed of dark matter, and that these souls can interact with each other, then it would certainly make sense why, even though spirits exist, they are notoriously difficult to capture on camera or identify using standard scientific sensors.
They should all show up on MRI scans.
Right, exactly. So if you build a theory on the premise that souls are basically dark matter, then you can theoretically explain all of these things. That's why, fundamentally, if you construct your theory with the assumption that souls are dark matter, it becomes much easier to explain the issue of near-death experiences. That was the main point of the first part of the paper. Let's summarize the characteristics of dark matter again. Everyone acknowledges that dark matter exists in this universe. There should be about 5 times as much dark matter as there is ordinary matter in the world. But why can't we detect this dark matter? It's because it's invisible. It doesn't interact with light or electromagnetic waves. That's why we can't see it. We know that such substances exist. What we're claiming is that if you assume souls are made of dark matter, then it makes sense that spiritual phenomena are hard to detect and can't be measured with various electromagnetic devices. But it also makes it easier to explain the idea that everyone has a soul, right? That's the point.
So basically, if you assume the properties of dark matter as currently described and apply them to the concept of the soul, everything matches up, right? But people often ask, why do we even say that dark matter exists in the first place? This is something you hear all the time. If it's invisible and can't be detected, how do we even know it's there? What's the reason for that?
Well, basically, it's because dark matter interacts with gravity. For example, when you look at celestial bodies, if there's something invisible present, you can tell by the way things move. So by observing their orbits, you can detect that something is there through its gravitational effects, right? I see. That applies to black holes as well, but it's not just black holes. It's become clear that unless there are a lot more invisible things scattered everywhere, the gravitational force needed to hold something like this galaxy together wouldn't exist. I see. That's why the amount of invisible matter is 5 times greater than the matter we know. We've come to understand that such things exist. This is the reason we can say that dark matter definitely exists. That's the basis for it.
Moving on to the next topic, where exactly is the spirit world? But where do you think the afterlife actually exists specifically?
That was really the key point this time. In other words, even if we consider souls to be dark matter, when we look at near-death experiences, there's always a tunnel somewhere. And beyond that tunnel lies a vast world of light. Some people have seen a field of flowers there, others have seen a river flowing. And there are even people who have seen dome-shaped structures. There are even stories of people entering inside those structures, so there are actually testimonies that such worlds do exist. On the other hand, when we look at it from the perspective of our physics or astronomy, we have the Earth, the Sun, and the galaxy, but nowhere do we see such places where those kinds of structures exist, right?
No, we don't. Although some say that maybe they're in Saturn's rings.
In Saturn's rings, huh? As always, you throw in some interesting stuff.
Well, people do often say that, but basically it is generally said that they simply don't exist.
So we have to think again about what exactly that means, how to interpret it. Let's discuss this as well, and as a hypothesis, consider the most straightforward idea. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that such a place actually exists. Yeah, well...
After all, everyone is seeing the same kind of thing.
So if people are seeing it, that should make it real, right?
Yes, that is exactly right.
So if we organize what conditions would be necessary for such a thing to exist, we can get closer to the truth. Don't you think?
I'd like to ask about that.
The topic that came up there is actually quite broad. If there really is an afterlife, what would be the conditions under which it exists but cannot be observed? Logically, there are 2 possibilities. One possibility, similar to what I mentioned earlier about souls, is the world of dark matter. If we assume that dark matter mostly gathers at the bottom of the Earth, then perhaps it quietly sinks down there. And in fact, there's a vast afterlife created by dark matter. This is plausible. People often say that the inside of the Earth is too hot for life to exist, but the very concept of hot is due to interactions with electromagnetic forces. So if dark matter were to fall to the bottom of the Earth, it wouldn't actually be hot there. That's why, when you think about it this way, one interpretation is that the world of dark matter forms the afterlife. However, there's a very big problem here. Dark matter is a substance that doesn't interact with the atoms that make up us and our world. So, the question is, how does it stick together?
That's exactly what I was most curious about.
If the world of souls is made of dark matter, then we can't actually prove it. So, as another way of thinking, What we considered is that the afterlife might exist in extra dimensions that are separate from our own.
Extra dimensions, that sounds like a complicated term.
Yes, yes, yes. From here on, things get incredibly challenging and complex. But this concept of extra dimensions is actually something that's being very seriously considered and rigorously analyzed in current physics, as actually existing within our physical reality.
It's also often used to explain parallel worlds, isn't it?
Readers of Tokana are actually quite knowledgeable about this topic. I certainly agree with that perspective. But when we speak in the complex language of modern physics, there is a concept known as superstring theory. If we choose to think in those specific terms, it might actually be possible to explain the existence of the afterlife. That is, in fact, the very second major and fundamental point of our research paper.
What is string theory?
String theory is actually the mainstream theory in quantum physics right now. If you keep dividing matter in this world into smaller and smaller pieces, in the end, it becomes an incredibly tiny string. That's what superstring theory is.
That sounds really complicated, but when you break matter down into really tiny pieces, for some reason, instead of being round like you'd imagine, are you saying it actually becomes a string?
Exactly, exactly. They're straight lines, but they vibrate like this, and it's been discovered that these are what make up everything in the world.
I see. Since matter is born from vibrations, the thing creating those vibrations isn't a sphere, but a vibration itself. So it's a string that generates those vibrations, right?
Exactly, exactly. But there's something even more important about this superstring theory. According to superstring theory, our world isn't three-dimensional, it's actually 10-dimensional. This is the key point. So how about it, theoretically speaking?